Hello and welcome to this special interview where we shall be talking a bit about Napoleon today, and I am joined by the masterful Apostolic Majesty. How are you, sir?
Hello, Bo. It's lovely to be here in person for the first time.
Yeah.
And it just occurred to, I think, both you and I, just a few minutes before this, that this is taking place on Bastille Day, so all the more appropriate, or at least it's going to be recorded on Bastille Day.
Right, yeah. It's great to have you in. I don't think it's needless sycophancy to say I've very rarely ever known, let alone met someone with your depth of knowledge. So it's always a pleasure to pick your brain, it really is. So today we thought we'd talk about the question, was Napoleon good for France? That's what you thought would be an interesting topic of discussion.
I did indeed. And the reason I think it's a very important question, and to again emphasize France specifically, is that so much of the Napoleonic myth, I guess, and the whole notion of grandeur, Gaullist grandeur, is wrapped up in the association that France has, you can say, the natural right to be the great leader of Europe in more ways than one, not just in terms of culture, but also in terms of military might and glory, etc. And no figure ostensibly would seem to epitomize that more so than Napoleon, Napoleon le Grand, Napoleon the Great, the man who at one point conquered Europe and then lost it all within the space of a couple of years. And my contention here, looking at Napoleon, is that I believe this is a man who was given so many opportunities to build for France an unassailable legacy, not just in territory, but in terms of culture and his economy and his ability to trade and dominate European markets. And several years ago, I came to the conclusion that Napoleon had bungled that opportunity. And he had bungled it in a way that was so decisive that I believe it left France almost bordering on second-tier nation status forevermore. And when you look at a politician like de Gaulle, it seems that the whole notion of grandeur is in many ways a sense of overcompensating for that loss.
It's interesting. It's interesting to talk about, just in the broadest sense, the sweep of history, sort of the Gallic grandeur that you talk about, going back to sort of the Franks and Charlemagne and 1,000 years before, almost.
Indeed. Well, you can almost look at this and say that the way I try and structure history, I mean, in deference to your Epoch show, I try to see history in terms of broad parallels, not broad in the sense that these are nebulous by any means, not at all. But you can say that modern France was formed of Clovis, even though there is a train of thought that puts it further to Vercingetorix and the Gauls. But when you look at someone like Clovis, you look at the Merovingians, and then they coalesce into the Carolingians. Under someone like Charlemagne, who is really not just the founder of France as a nation, but also the founder of Germany as a nation as well. It seems that the whole notion of the Franks and that ability to dominate Europe and assume the mantle of Caesarian rulership, the restoration of the Roman Empire, is not enough that Charlemagne was able to assume that dominant position within Europe during the 9th century, but he was also emperor. It seems that what I see with Napoleon is there is so much conscious historical reenactment in a figure like Napoleon. Napoleon begins as a man with so much, I would say, promise in terms of all the goodwill that had been bestowed upon a particular tumultuous time within French history. And then he aspires to this Carolingian restoration, almost directly 1,000 years after the original Charlemagne. Except unlike Charlemagne, there isn't this glorious French epoch of a new Holy Roman Empire that's born out of it. Instead, ultimately, the 19th century in European history is very much the tale of how Germany came to surpass France. All the more ironic because I believe that German nationalism, as we understand it in the 19th century, is impossible without a figure like Napoleon. In many ways, you can say that Napoleon does more to benefit Germany and even Italy in the long run than he does for France.
And Britain.
Indeed Britain, of course.
Yeah. So that's one of the first things, when you mentioned this to me a week or so ago, that we would talk about this, my first gut reaction, or the first an instant in my mind is, no, Napoleon was terrible for France. absolute terrible, a disaster, a catastrophe for France. But then the more I've sort of mulled it over and thought about it, although I still think that if I had to pick one side of the ledger or the other, I would pick bad, negative. But there are certainly positives. I think you admit there must be some. And although our question is specific, was he good for France? The thing I kept coming back to was, if it wasn't for Napoleon and then the Battle of the Nile and Trafalgar, Britain wouldn't have, I know it's not within the purview of our question, but as an aside, Britain wouldn't have dominated, I wouldn't have thought, it during the 19th century as hard as it did if we hadn't had the opportunity to annihilate the French Navy. That's a fair thing to say, do you think?
It is, interestingly. But I suppose that question then becomes, you have taken the question, was Napoleon good for France? And you have said, inevitably, he was good for all of France's neighbours, especially Britain. I think it might be instructive for those listening just to have a brief overview, because I don't want to get ahead and assume that everyone knows everything about Napoleon. So just to give a very brief trajectory of what he did. The French Revolution happens in 1789. It becomes more radical, and the French ruling family are deposed, and then they are executed as a result of the guillotine. The French Revolution mutates into a feverishly zealous epoch during Maximilien Robespierre called the Reign of Terror, where it begins killing off basically the own proponents of the revolution, such as prominently Danton and the Hepatists. And then there is a period, you can say, of trying to moderate the worst excesses of the revolution, following the revolutionary zeal that eventually leads to the execution of those who incited it, Saint-Just and Robespierre himself. And then you have a figure like Napoleon. Napoleon is basically entering into a political vacuum, which is caused by this period of moderation called the Directory. He is very young. He is a young Corsican minor noble, and he quickly demonstrates his military brilliance in evicting the British from the French naval port of Toulon. He then goes on to counter a royalist insurrection in 1795, and that gives him command of an army in Italy. What Napoleon does is turn Italy from a sideshow in the overall war of the coalition powers against France, trying to cancel out the French Revolution, and he makes Italy the decisive frontier during the war, which was previously Germany. He wins a series of battles, such as Lodi, and he's able to impose on his main adversary, Austria, a peace basically by his own volition. And what that does is basically demonstrate that the Directory and the French political system can't really deal with someone who is as ambitious and as determined to rise to the heights of his own predestined star as Napoleon. And so Napoleon very much seems to be determining French foreign policy as well as military strategy. He then goes on, he conquers Egypt briefly, goes off into Syria, and then his navy is decisively defeated, as you mentioned, at the Battle of the Nile, causing him to abandon his army, then turn back. But again, a man who was never shy to spin all of these military setbacks in the best possible light. The conquest of Egypt becomes this great Oriental expedition. It's the birth of Egyptology, and it is French science that is conquered, even though French armies have been left stranded here. And so he becomes the sword of a conspiracy to upend this French political system, led by other great French revolutionaries such as Sieyès, who wrote What is the Third Estate, one of the most famous pre-revolutionary pamphlets. Ultimately, he's able to sideline all of these people who thought they could use Napoleon. He establishes a personal dictatorship called the Consulate, and then he moves on essentially to become embroiled in a series of wars with all of the neighboring powers. He fights off Britain, he fights off Austria, wins a battle at Marengo, and then he assumes to himself the power of an emperor, more so than that being a consul. And he justifies it essentially by saying that I am going to be Caesarian, it's a republican office. You know, the last time I think you and I discussed history, we talked about the Emperor Augustus. Well, again, as so much of Napoleon's history was conscious historical reenactment, so too he was assuming the office of Augustus, and he was having the Pope there to officiate over the proceedings and bless this new recreation of a Carolingian empire.
Hmm.
You can say at the beginning there were these overtly republican affectations, but eventually they became dynastic, absolutist, monarchical, and ultimately you can say to the detriment of France. And so Napoleon goes off in the next few years and achieves some remarkable victories against the Austrians and the Russians at Austerlitz. He is able to win decisive victories against the Prussians with his Marshal Davout at Jena and the Battle of Auerstadt, defeats the Russians at Friedland, compels them to peace at Tilsit, and it seems that Napoleon's at the top of the world.
Mm.
Then Napoleon makes a series of unforced errors. You've already mentioned the Battle of Trafalgar. You can't really blame Napoleon for that because
No.
he wasn't leading the fleets, nor was he an admiral. But you can blame Napoleon for the after effects of that, which is that Napoleon believed, I cannot defeat Britain through a system of naval interdiction or by being able to overcome the maritime strength of the British Empire. So I'm going to cut off the lifeblood of the empire, which is trade, continental trade with Europe. And that is the birth of the continental system. Now, the horrible logic of the continental system for Napoleon is that it necessitated that Napoleon assume control of more and more and more facets, not just of European territory, but more of European political life. It leads him to what you can say to be his greatest disaster, which is the invasion of Portugal and by extension the invasion of Spain.
Mm-hmm.
It's not enough to depose his allies. The justification becomes more spurious. You are not efficient enough in enforcing the British naval blockade. And in that terms, he deposes his own relatives. He deposes his brother Louis, who had been made king of the Netherlands. He deposes his brother Jerome, who had been made king of Westphalia, out of the territories of Oldenburg and North Germany. At one point, France even has a border into the Baltic Sea with Denmark. And then, of course, the worst impulses of the continental system force Napoleon, by his own logic, to invade Russia, to compel Russia to come back and become part of this continental system. And after, we all know, Napoleon was defeated in Russia, what does Napoleon do? Does Napoleon try and make peace? Does Napoleon try to lessen his ambitions as a result of the continental system? No. He continues to fight. And even though he has an advocate in one of his former enemies in the form of Metternich in Austria, he keeps on fighting. And ultimately, he loses everything, is deposed, and is reduced merely to the emperor of the island of Elba. And then, when he believes there's tumult among the Allies and unrest in France, he comes back and leads one of the most bizarre periods in French history, which is the 100 Days Campaign, which, of course, we all know as culminating in the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon is defeated by Wellington. Thereafter, he is sent off to St. Helena and he dies there in exile.
I mean, I feel like I absolutely agree with you that he messed up. He dropped the ball, however you want to say it. That he led himself to Elba, and then St. Helena, in all sorts of ways. It's like he had his destiny in his own hands. He made unforced errors. You said, yeah, the deposing of the Spanish royal family. In hindsight, anyway, it's easy to say these things, isn't it? In hindsight,
I don't think it is. I don't think it is actually. I think, I mean, that's another sort of comparison is like, why did Hitler invade the Soviet Union in 1941? You can say in hindsight, why did he do that? He obviously lost. But no, I think it's not with the benefit of hindsight. I think it's the result of hubris, fundamentally, that made him, forced him into a decision which was so ultimately detrimental, and not just detrimental in terms of his own strategic picture and that of the legacy of France. It was a betrayal in terms of his own alliances, his own ability to show that he can cooperate with people. I mean, let me just again emphasize why I believe there is so much hope in a figure like Napoleon. After the disasters of the worst excesses of the French Revolution, where France was basically in a totalitarianism as a concept is rather anachronistic to the 18th century, but especially Paris becomes a political hellscape during the year 1793, 1794. And the Directory, you can say, is a very weak attempt to lessen the worst excesses that have come out as a result of that. You have the stabilization of the currency, the replacement of the assignat with the franc, the creation of 5 directors who were supposed to moderate one another in terms of the overall headship of France. You had the creation of a a new legislature, the Council of the 500, which is supposed to be more conservative than the preceding legislature, which was the National Convention. And then you enter into that Napoleon. The problem with the Directory is that most of its members, frankly, were corrupt. And in a war, I think it's fair to say that what one needs is undivided command. And so therefore it's natural that someone as ambitious and certain in his own veritas, the truth of his actions, is going to ultimately sideline an institution like the Directory, which ultimately he does. He's going to impose peace treaties of his own volition, like we see with the Austrians in 1797. So therefore, it's only natural that so many French politicians looked to Napoleon and the ambitious young general and said, this is a man that can stabilize any regime in the future because he is popular, he is shown to be successful, and he has that ambition, you can say again, to ensure the greatness of France. Everything you want, ostensibly, from a leader. So after the coup of Brumaire, Napoleon, as I mentioned, completely sidelines those who believe that they could control him. But I think it's important to emphasize that Napoleon, from the outset, during the consulate period, demonstrated that he was capable of working with people. So, for example, one of the great successes of Napoleonic politics were the successes of his foreign minister Talleyrand, who is a nefarious mainstay in French political culture, right from the beginning of the French Revolution, where he's the one demanding the nationalization of monastic property, all the way up until the 1830s.
Right, so he outlives Napoleon and still continues on in
exactly.
incredible life.
Yes, he's an influential figure in the Orleanist government long after Napoleon. You know, a mainstay in French politics for 50 years, effectively. But under a figure like Talleyrand, the French revolutionary government demonstrates that it is able to moderate its ambitions. It's not solely determined in overthrowing all of Europe's monarchs and imposing the legacy of the French Revolution, like all the precepts of the rights of man, etc., onto Europe by right of force. Talleyrand is able to, say, for example, use an alliance with Spain in order to shore up France's position in Italy, which is pivotal, given that Napoleon himself had come to power by shaping the power balance in Italy itself. And then you have a process known as the mediatizations, whereby Napoleon and Talleyrand were able basically to use the greed of the Russian Tsar Alexander to carve up large sections of Germany and compensate various princes, whilst giving France vast amounts of territory on the left bank of the Rhine. If anything was to doom the Holy Roman Empire, it was Tsar Alexander and Napoleon carving up the empire during the mediatizations several years before the formal end of the Holy Roman Empire. So, as you can probably see, this demonstrates again that Napoleon is willing to concede points of foreign policy to a very able minister in the form of Talleyrand. He is also able to moderate the anti-clerical nature of the French Revolution. So, as a result of the French Revolution, the religious calendar, the 7-day week, had been abolished, and France had decided to assume decimal time, which is the décade, the 10-day week, and the Republican celebrations in lieu of All Saints' Days and religious celebrations. And of course, the abolition of things like Sunday was seen as pivotal in terms of being able to de-Christianize France. Napoleon does away with all of that, something the Directory had been unable to do. And what he then goes on to do is negotiate with the Pope a concordat, which not only normalizes the political relations with the papacy in Italy, because the papacy was still a major political power in Italy at that point, but it also ensures that France is seen to be a Catholic power in the style of its Gallican forebears, like King Francis or King Louis XIV, who were determined to assume that the French political system had ultimate power over the appointment of bishops, not the destruction of Christianity within France itself, as had been the raison d'etre of the revolution. So then, you can say a major moderating achievement of a strong man such as Napoleon. And then you brought up the example of the destruction of the British fleet at the Battle of the Nile. This culminates in the Peace of Amiens, whereby France and Britain are at peace. All of a sudden, it would seem that Napoleon has done the impossible And after only a few years of coming in and winning his decisive victory at Marengo, he is able to bring peace to France after having already stabilized the internal situation in France, tried basically to undermine the French royalist insurrection in the Vendée and the Chouannerie in Brittany and places like that. And if you look at the terms of the Peace of Amiens, Britain actually was prepared to concede a lot to France for the sake of winning that peace. So, for example, the areas that Britain had occupied, which were part of the Dutch or the Batavian Republic, which was now a French client, like Cape Town in particular, the Cape Colony, modern-day South Africa, was returned to the Netherlands. Areas like Malta, which had been occupied after Napoleon's expedition, where he had temporarily annexed it only for the British to come in and then annex Malta. Malta was to be restored back to the Knights Hospitaller. Britain was prepared to allow French Louisiana to come back into existence. All of these things, which you can say would go well to normalize relations with Britain. But again, this is where Napoleon, in his desire basically already from the beginning to establish a de facto continental system where France has the overriding interest in the continent, he cannot understand how Britain can have any interests in the continent now that peace has been achieved, despite the fact that at the time, the King of Great Britain was also the Elector of Hanover, and so was actually one of the great European sovereigns and holding a large section of Germany, which was only comparable to places like Bavaria and Prussia itself. And indeed, of course, the notion that why on earth would Britain tolerate a power which has consolidated control over the entirety of the continent, thereby placing Britain in a position of existential turmoil, which has been basically Britain's policy since the War of the Spanish Succession 100 years before. So Napoleon takes that peace and he goes a little bit further and decides, I'm going to annex Switzerland. I'm going to turn it into a client state, the Helvetic Republic. Even though, and this is something which is really important to understand, when Talleyrand was negotiating the Treaty of Lunéville with Austria and the Treaty of Amiens with Britain, he privately came to the conclusion that this is the summit of achievable French power within the bounds of peace. That being, France has achieved what it wanted in the Napoleonic and the Revolutionary Wars, a new border where France was protected on all sides by natural frontiers. The Pyrenees in the south against Spain, the Alps in the east against Italy, the Rhine in the north against Germany. And again, you're looking at this in terms of legacy. You're looking at this in terms of German nationalism, French control over Belgium, over the left bank of the Rhine, and potentially over areas like the Ruhr Valley and the city of Mayence or Mainz in German. You can understand that had France been able to achieve control over these natural borders, French domination of Europe would have been assured up until probably this day, given the wealth of those territories and the impetus they gave towards Prussian and later German industrialization. So Talleyrand understands this, and he understands that any further steps will inevitably lead to a renewal of hostilities. But Napoleon can't help himself. So as I mentioned, he annexes the Helvetic Republic. And that's also another point. The French revolutionaries, in terms of historical reenactment, were obsessed with renaming historic polities and giving them Roman-era names. So obviously, you'll be familiar, it's not enough to be Switzerland, one needs to be Helvetia after the Helvetii, in the same way that it's not enough to be the Netherlands, one needs to be Batavia after the original Batavians. There is the Cisalpine Republic, which of course Cisalpine Gaul. They even tried to rename the Neapolitan state at one point to a name which is so obscure that it's left me. But nevertheless, it sort of demonstrates that the French took this process of neoclassical reenactment very seriously.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.